Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, and Yu-Gi-Oh! The three biggest trading card games have two things in common, and that's it. They're all trading card games, and they all were released in the 1990s. And that's literally where the similarities end. But what if Pokemon was more like the other two? You see, Pokemon is a very linear and straightforward game. There isn't a lot of interactivity between each player during their turns. And Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic the Gathering both have different ways to interact with the opponent directly during their turns. For Magic the Gathering, this is called a counterspell, which is basically used to negate or stop an opposing spell or other card. And for Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played during phases, and yes, I had to do research for this. I have no idea how either other trading card game works, and what I found is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Essentially uses a phase system, where each player's turns are divided into, I believe, 5 phases. And essentially, this allows for more interactive gameplay because it's easier to integrate in counter cards, which are called trap cards. And so, one of my viewers on one of my most recent videos was requesting that I look into the possibility of trap cards in the Pokemon TCG. And honestly, if I had a nickel for every time that I've indirectly copied an idea from Celio's network without even knowing that that video existed, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't much, but it's strange that it happened twice. But today, I'll be shaking it up a little bit and kind of focusing less on the topic of what if and more of what would the cards themselves look like. So today, I have 5 different cards custom cards that I created that kind of show off what I think trap cards would look like in the Pokemon TCG. Essentially, they're all centered around kind of countering an opponent's action that is usually a once per turn sort of thing, in order to kind of protect yourself or make things a little bit worse for your opponent. And I'll explain more about what I mean by this as you see the cards, and I'll kind of walk through each step with you. So yeah, let's just get started. Before we get started, I would quickly ask to see if you're subscribed. I put a ton of effort into planning and making these videos, which can get tough sometimes due to me being a college student. Subscribing helps support me and my channel, and it allows me to make more videos like the ones you're currently watching. And if you want to help support my channel even further, consider becoming a member. With 3 different tiers to choose from, you'll get access to my videos early, get exclusive behind-the-scenes updates, you'll get creative inputs on new videos, and more. Every member will also be featured in the credits of every single one of my videos. Thank you so much for your support so far. Now, let's get back to the video. The first one that we have is Knockout Neutralizer, which is an item card. These are all called counter cards. They're basically a subset of cards that only can be used on your opponent's turn. Knockout Neutralizer is an item card that says you can only use it during your opponent's turn, and when one of your opponent's Pokemon uses an ability that basically would cause that Pokemon to knock itself out from the ability, you can discard 2 cards from your hand to completely ignore any effects of that ability, meaning that the effects of the ability won't happen. That Pokemon will still be knocked out, and you'll take your prizes for it, but the effect won't happen. So mainly, Knockout Neutralizer was meant to counter Dusknoir, which came out in Shrouded Fable, and it's terrorized the TCG, not as much as I thought it would, but it's still, in specific decks, is absolutely super oppressive, and doesn't really have a solid counter outside, like, Enamorous V, which is pretty terrible, and only works for Psychic-type decks. So, Knockout Neutralizer was my answer to Dusknoir. Basically, this is an item card, so it can be used multiple times, which is a bit overpowered for being able to take a free prize card, but you also have to remember, you have to discard 2 cards, and you have to have it in your hand if your opponent tries to use their Dusknoir. Now, this can be telegraphed ahead of time, potentially by both sides. If you're the one playing Knockout Neutralizer, you can see your opponent setting up a Dusknoir, like you can see the Duskulls on the bench, you can see maybe a Dusclops about to go, maybe evolve into a Dusknoir and then blow up, and then you can use Knockout Neutralizer. So basically, the turn order would go, your opponent tries to use Dusknoir, then you use Knockout Neutralizer to counter their Dusknoir before they place damage counters. And essentially, this is supposed to, like, just stop them dead in their tracks. Before they can do anything else, you just stop it, they just knock out the Pokemon, and they don't place any of the damage counters. This also would affect things like Fortress EX, which is not really a playable card at all in the slightest. But basically, this would negate Fortress EX's ability as well, and they'd KO it, and you'd get 2 prize cards. So I could see how this is a little bit overpowered as an item card, but as a supporter card, which we'll get to, there are supporter cards in this list, I feel like it would be a little bit awkward and a little weird, and plus no one would play it because then that's your supporter for the turn. And I'll explain, there are some niche rules to all of this, but basically Knockout Neutralizer can only be used during your opponent's turn, and it's an item card. So we have one other item card, and that is Ace Regulation Policy. Ace Regulation Policy is essentially an A-Spec blocker. And you use it whenever your opponent places down an A-Spec card in any way. A-Specs can be, they can be trainer cards, they can be and energy cards as well. So there's a very wide pool of them. Obviously, you have things like Prime Catcher, Unfair Stamp, you have Neo Upper Energy, Secret Box, all these different ones, Legacy Energy too. All these different A-Specs that can be countered by Ace Regulation Policy. And essentially, Ace Regulation Policy says you can only use this card during your opponent's turn, like all the other ones do. I'm probably just going to say it each time just because I'm reading the card. When your opponent plays an A-Spec card from their hand, you may discard a card from your hand to play this card. Prevent all effects of that A-Spec. No matter what the A-Spec is, you'd basically be able to block that A-Spec and say, hey, guess what? That does nothing. You can't actually use this. And essentially, if your opponent tried to use Prime Catcher, this stops them from being able to use Prime Catcher. And if they try to use, like, Unfair Stamp, you're like, nope, we're actually not going to do that. Both of us keep our hands. And if it's like Neo Upper, they attach the energy, and then you actually say, no, that's not, like, that can't happen. Or, like, Legacy Energy as well. And I guess Treasure Energy, because apparently that's a thing. Or whatever it's called. It's terrible. Please don't play it. Anyways, this would get a little bit weird because, and I'll explain more about kind of how this would affect turn order and sequencing later, because that is the biggest problem with these cards. But just be patient, I'll explain all of it in a little bit once I'm done kind of going through all these cards. So essentially, this would basically, if your opponent attached an energy, and then you played Ace Regulation Policy to counter it, your opponent would technically not count as their energy attachment for the turn. It's just because that would be way too broken. If you could just stop an energy attachment completely, I feel like it prevents all effects of that A-Spec. That wording also says any effects of that A-Spec also would technically mean that the effect of attaching that energy would be negated as well. So, and if it's like a supporter card, which there's not any A-Spec supporter cards, sorry, I'm a little tired today, basically any effects of that A-Spec are negated immediately. If it's like Grand Tree or Neutralization Zone, and your opponent places it down, and then you play Ace Regulation Policy right after, then basically you just make them shuffle it back into their deck, and they can't use the Stadium. Items are probably the easiest to counter because you can just play them right away. Energies and Stadiums are slightly different, but I think it's Energies that are the ones that are probably the most confusing. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But those are the two item cards. Note that the item cards do have a secondary, like a drawback of having to discard cards in order to prevent it. But this kind of negates, not really negates, it's more like it kind of balances out the fact that you can play multiple of them, because you basically have to have the correct card at the correct time, and that's not always possible to do that, because not only do you have to focus on your own strategy, you also have to get your counter cards out before your opponent does their strategy. And plus, there's plenty of ways that your opponent can disrupt this, or whatever, with hand disruption, stuff like that. So, Ace Regulation Policy and Knockout Neutralizer are both kind of balanced in the sense that they're only ever going to be used in very niche scenarios, probably only once or twice in a game, depending on how many you play, and plus this would probably only be used. These cards would basically only be used in decks that can afford to use them, decks that can afford the deck space, and plus it's probably most likely gonna be a one-of copy of each. This probably would increase the amount of like control play or whatever, because Ace Regulation Policy can stop things like Prime Catcher or something like that that could switch out a Pokemon if you're stuck with Snorlax, or Knockout Neutralizer could stop a Dusknoir from blowing up your Cornerstone Ogerpon or something like that. It's basically geared towards protecting your Pokemon, and that's kind of the whole point of all of these counter cards. The next up, we have one tool. Tools were a nightmare to try and make. I literally spent probably around a half hour straight trying to figure out the wording for this card, and I'm not joking. I literally tried to think of it as I was making the art for this card, and yes, for all of these 3 cards, I did make the art for them. They're basic, I know, but they're kind of just trying to get the point across, and I think they do a pretty good job. I don't know. Let me know what you think about the art on the cards in the comments. I really would appreciate some feedback, because I am trying to integrate more of my art into my videos. But basically, Confusing Symbols is a tool card, and tool cards are weird. Very, very weird. We've had one other instance of a tool card being able to attach to your opponent's Pokemon. We'll talk about that in just a second. First off, let's talk about Confusing Symbols. Confusing Symbols can only be used during your opponent's turn, and if the opposing active Pokemon has no Pokemon tool cards attached to it. So basically, this would at any time during your opponent's turn, you can attach the card to your opponent's active Pokemon. The Pokemon this card is attached to is now confused until it leaves the active spot. So Confusing Symbols would stay on that Pokemon. If it leaves the active spot, like if it gets scooped up by Professor Turos, if it retreats, if it switches out, Confusing Symbols gets discarded back to the player who played it on their discard pile. And or if the special condition gets removed, which we don't really see any sort of special condition healing or whatever in the game right now competitively. So Confusing Symbols most likely would be used towards the end of a turn. Let's say your opponent tries to if you're playing against Charizard. Like the biggest example that I thought of with Confusing Symbols is if you're against Charizard. Let's say your opponent sends up Pidgeot to start the turn. You're not going to want to attach the Confusing Symbols to the Pidgeot, because A, it's not going to attack, and B, it has free retreat, so it just get rid of the Confusing Symbols anyways. What you could do is you could wait until your opponent sends up their Charizard, and then you can attach the Confusing Symbols. Now, this would get a little bit weird, because if you attach it too late, then they can already announce their attack, and then it's too late. You can't you can't attach the card. But you also don't want to do it too early, because otherwise your opponent might have like an option like Prime Catcher or something to switch out and potentially prevent Confusing Symbols from working. And also I thought Confusion was probably the best option for a special condition to be affected by. Confusion is probably the most... Confusion and Burn are probably the 2 most underrated special conditions in the entire game. And I want to give Confusion a little bit of love, because at the very worst, it's still possible to hit through the Confusion. It's a 50-50 chance. It just makes things reliant on a coin flip. But it's honestly not as bad as being like asleep or paralyzed, where you just cannot do anything about it. Confusing Symbols just feels like a way to kind of have a chance to survive against a Pokemon and kind of allow you to get some chip damage in by making your opponent do the work for you. And so that's kind of the idea with Confusing Symbols. Again, sequencing can get very awkward, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but we have 2 supporter cards. So, tool cards, also one more thing, Confusing Symbols is meant to, as a tool card, be able to also jam up your opponent's active Pokemon's tool card, because it takes up that tool card spot until it leaves the active spot. So just one extra little bit of a kind of one little extra jab, I guess. Next up, we have 2 supporter cards that block specific styles of gameplay, and ones that are designed to either boost your opponent through trainer cards, or yeah, just boost your opponent during with trainer cards, or make things worse for you with like disruption or whatever. First off, we have Nemona's Challenge. Nemona's Challenge is a supporter card, and the supporter rule for these counter cards is that you can not use a supporter of your own during your next turn, in order to basically negate the sort of super broken ability that these have, and plus it would be your one of only, so you can't play multiple of them if your opponent tries to play multiple disruption cards. So basically, Nemona's Challenge says that when your opponent tries to use a trainer card that would affect your hand during their turn, you may play this card. You prevent all effects of that card done to you or your hand. So essentially, this is like Evolving Skies Milotic, if anyone remembers that. It basically protects your hand from getting like Iono'd, Unfair Stamped, Rock Sand, stuff like that. And essentially it just is a block, and that's all it is. And that's your supporter for the turn, for your turn technically, which is a bit odd. But this also this is balanced in a sense that you can basically keep your hand, and if your opponent uses Iono or Judge or something like that, you're still shuffling. They're still shuffling their hand into their deck. So it's not like a completely useless supporter for them. They still have a chance to get what they want anyways if they're trying to use it as draw. But if it's in like late game and you're both at like 2 or 1 prize or whatever, and your opponent tries to use it, you can just use Nemona's Challenge and block it, and then it puts your opponent in a bad position rather than you. And I feel like this is a fair trade-off for not being able to use your supporter next turn, because disruption can completely ruin a seemingly unlosable game for you. I've had that happen so many times to me, and I'm sure probably many of you have had the same situation where you were so close to victory, but then your opponent used like Iono at the last turn and put you down to 1 card, and then it gave you an unusable card, you top deck nothing, and then you just lose an unlosable game, essentially. And Nemona's Challenge would basically be able to kind of counter that in a sense that, and this would be probably the easiest one to sequence. If your opponent tries to use Iono, you can just play down Nemona's Challenge right away. This also works against Unfair Stamp. Technically, this goes in tandem with Ace Regulation Policy, but Nemona's Challenge also prevents other supporters from being used. So if anything, I would see probably most decks, if they were to play counter cards, Nemona's Challenge would probably be one of the more popular choices because it allows you to protect yourself. Especially with decks that are playing like the Pidgeot engine, you can search it out with the Pidgeot engine, and then also you can afford to sacrifice your supporter for the turn because you can still search out whatever you want next turn anyways. So Nemona's Challenge is I think it's pretty balanced as a supporter card, and I think also Looker's Authority, the final card that we're going to look at today, is pretty balanced as well. Looker's Authority is also another supporter. It means that you can't use another supporter during your next turn, but basically, it's a boss and prime catcher, or counter catcher, like literally a gust negator, and basically this is how this works. If your opponent plays like Boss's Orders, or they play Prime or Counter Catcher, you can use Looker's Authority and prevent all effects of that card done to you or your Pokemon. So let's say your opponent tries to, probably the most awkward scenario would be if your opponent tries to use Prime Catcher. The requirement is that Prime Catcher has to put up an opposing Pokemon first before you put up your Pokemon. And essentially, Looker's Authority would prevent that from even happening. Prime Catcher would be useless, and it would be just discarded, essentially, because preventing all effects of that card done to you or your Pokemon negates the first effect, which in turn negates the secondary effect of switching your own Pokemon. And so that's kind of my idea for Looker's Authority, is that it's basically also another way to protect you from an opposing strategy, especially if your opponent's trying to get like boss for game or whatever. Now, of course, like I mentioned briefly like a minute ago, this would probably be best in like a Pidgeot deck where they can search it out with Pidgeot and kind of have it as a fail-safe opportunity. But there's also the possibility that your opponent won't go for Gust that turn, or that they will go for Gust and then you use something like Nemona's Challenge. And basically this is kind of where I think the ultimate sort of balancing comes into play. You basically, by playing these cards, are sacrificing slots in your deck to forward your own game in order to counter your opponent's game. And it's difficult to be able to have the exact correct card to be able to counter your opponent at the specific time during their turn, because you don't know what your opponent's going to play. Your opponent could play Iono or Boss, or they could play both. And for example, if your opponent tried to play like Prime Catcher, and you use Looker's Authority to block that Prime Catcher, then your opponent can just go ahead and say, oh, okay, well then I'll use Iono, and you can't block that because of the fact that you already used your supporter, technically your supporter for the turn. Now I should specify that you can't use more than one supporter. This technically would count as your only supporter for both the rest of your opponent's turn and your next turn. So you couldn't use Looker's Authority and Nemona at the same time, but you could use something like Ace Regulation Policy and then Looker's Authority if your opponent tried like using Unfair Stamp and then they tried using Boss right after. This would be a way to block multiple opposing actions. In fact, you can use basically 4 of the 5 at any given time in a turn. You can block if you have all 4 of them. You can use Knockout Neutralizer to block your opponent's Dusknoir or whatever. You can use Ace Regulation Policy to stop their Ace Spec from working. Let's say it's like Unfair Stamp. You stop them from using Ace Regulation Policy. And then you can attach Confusing Cymbals and basically say, hey, guess what? You're confused. Have fun dealing with the coin flip. And then also, you can use either Nemona's Challenge to block Iono or Roxanne like a disruption card, or you can use Looker's Authority to essentially prevent your opponent from being able to gust. So these are kind of all the cards that I had as ideas. But there is one major underlying problem. Sequencing. Sequencing in the Pokemon TCG is pretty linear compared to Magic and to Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the turn order is very, very easy. Like, where some people will say, like, oh, Pokemon is so easy compared to the other 2 TCGs. Yes, it's not as complicated in, like, the base actions that you do, but there's still, obviously, like, the mind games and whatever, and the secondary effects of not just the cards, but what happens to the players themselves as the battle goes on. And that's kind of one of the reasons for this counter, like I just talked about, is that it makes everything a guessing game. And it also makes in order to play these, you have to make sacrifices. But this comes at the cost of awkward sequencing. And honestly, just at first glance, some of these cards would be a nightmare to try and use in sequencing. Most notably, like the ones like Knockout Neutralizer or Nemona's Challenge or Looker's Authority or even Ace Regulation Policy. Really, all of these could possibly see play, but I think that there is, for I guess really only the true 2 ones that wouldn't really negatively affect anything would be Nemona's Challenge and Looker's Authority. Because these 2 directly stop the opponent from using an action that can be easily stopped at any time or reversed. It's basically a straightforward stop and saying, hey, you can't use this. I'm preventing the action. Whereas if it was something like Knockout Neutralizer, your opponent could already try and use that effect and knock out that Pokemon before you get a chance to use Knockout Neutralizer. And this happened to me recently at a cup where essentially my opponent started playing fast and they tried to take back actions and all that. And essentially they played so fast that I couldn't stop them and say, hey, go back and do this action again, or that you've already locked into this action, because they had already worked way past that. They were already far past that point. So if you tried to use Knockout Neutralizer, your opponent could already have placed the damage counters, knocked out the Dusknoir, and potentially taken prize cards, which is an unavoidable sort of situation where you can't really undo that action, because your opponent gets those prize cards, and then there's not really anything you can do about it. It's also would basically encourage everyone to start speed playing in order to prevent being affected by a counter card. Because they, like, by playing fast, your opponent can't really register, hey, I actually have this counter card in my hand, I can play this during the turn. And instead, people would basically start speeding it up, and speeding up their gameplay, so that way their opponent couldn't fully grasp the concept of what's happening, so they can't play that card. And Knockout Neutralizer is one of the ones where it's like, it creates a board state that's unable to be reversed. And it's the same thing with Ace Regulation Policy. Now, with ones like Unfair Stamp and Prime Catcher, this can be prevented potentially right away. Prime Catcher is probably like one of the easiest ones, because Prime Catcher is probably the easiest one, because it basically just says you just block it. Essentially, that's what you do, is you just say, no, you can't do this. But the problem is, if your opponent plays something like Unfair Stamp, they could already start shuffling their hand into their deck, and that's you can't take that action back, because it's not common knowledge of what your opponent had in their hand. So if you had to undo it, they could grab whatever they want, and that's just really confusing. And if it's something like, I don't know, whatever that weird special energy is, they could have already drawn their cards, and then that's that. Nothing else can be done about that. And then also, if they play something like Secret Box, they could discard 3 cards from their hand and then get a deck search. And by the time they already have done that, and you try to play Ace Regulation Policy, they've already discarded the necessary cards, and they've already started a deck search, both of which are actions that you can't take back. So basically, this is another card where it's like, you can't really take back the action, and it creates these really awkward scenarios that would be a nightmare to judge. I cannot imagine judging with these cards in the format. And look, I've tried to make them as fair and balanced to the meta as a whole, but their core concept is flawed, especially with Confusing Cymbals. Confusing Cymbals was already a nightmare to create, but I could not... Confusing Cymbals would be so ridiculously powerful to be used during your opponent's turn, because obviously that might wreck an opponent's entire strategy right there, and there's nothing that they can do to stop it. But also, in addition to that, Confusing Cymbals would have to be placed at the right time on the right Pokemon. What opponents could do in order to prevent being affected by Confusing Cymbals is they could just wait until the moment they're going to attack in order to just retreat. Like, for example, like the Pidgeot example that I talked about earlier with Charizard, they could just retreat and then send up Charizard as quickly as possible and then announce the attack before Confusing Cymbals could come into play. And this just creates so many terrible niche scenarios where it's just so confusing to try and understand what's going on, that it creates board states that are unfixable and therefore ruin the entire concept of the game. So, should the Pokemon TCG have trap cards? I'm just going to answer the overall question. No, absolutely not. There is no way that Pokemon should ever have these sorts of trap cards, because it would ruin sequencing so badly. And that's really the only reason. Pokemon is meant to be a straightforward, sort of step-by-step game. That's really it, is that every turn, it's a turn-based game. There is nothing that your opponent can do during your turn while you're taking your actions. Your opponent has, I'm sure Pokemon would have already done this by now. If they saw this, they probably would have, and they thought it was a good idea on a design standpoint, they would have already tried this as a gimmick, because both the other 2 main trading card games have done this, and it's created probably more interactive sort of scenarios and made the game more engaging at times. Sometimes your opponent will take hour-long turns, what feels like hour-long turns essentially, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just sit back and relax and watch your opponent do whatever the heck they want. And basically these cards would be super awesome in theory, but then when it actually gets down to it, they actually would be absolutely horrible for the game. So ultimately, I think that the TCG does not need counter cards or trap cards or counter, whatever you want to call it, essentially. The Pokemon TCG should not have trap cards, because that sequencing, that linear sequencing, is too delicate to kind of do anything. And Plus, like, sequencing already is delicate enough. Like, if you miss sequence, we've seen it in championship matches before. If you miss sequence something and if you do an action wrong or something, it can create literally can give you a game loss. It can give you double price penalties. It can literally just lose you the game on the spot, without you having, like, being able to take back the action, because sometimes those actions are irreversible. And some of these cards just encourage irreversible actions that are non-intentional by either side. It just is basically the way that it works out would be impossible to, like, if it happened, it would be impossible to fix. So, ultimately, trap cards are a no-no in the Pokemon TCG, and now I fully understand why Pokemon hasn't done this already. So, yeah, that's the video, really. That's gonna be all from me about sort of if Pokemon should have trap cards. I really hope you guys enjoyed. I do have more videos coming up. That poll that I put up to ask what to play discuss about or talk about what video you wanted next, essentially. That was sort of the order that I should make these videos in, and so trap cards won. So next up will be Archaludon EX, and then after that, I have a secret project that I'm working on. Hopefully it will come out sometime before the end of the year. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, God bless, have fun, we'll see you out there, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all so much for watching.